welcome back to English3033. I'm just checking in to respond both to people's minor assignments on reading backwards and forwards from the Odyssey, and also to maybe comment on some of the issues that arose during the discussion forum last week, which were dealing with thematically very similar stuff. So that we can maybe start bridging from those discussions towards the current unit that we're dealing with, which is reading across cultures. First of all, the discussions that people had were really engaging and interesting. When people were talking about the Tennyson poems, a lot of the discussion focused on the conversation between these two poems and the extent to which we can see the values that are embodied by Ulysses, Odysseus, in the Ulysses poem, and how they can be contrasted with the apparent values embodied in the Lotus Eaters poem. It was interesting the extent to which you guys differed in your interpretation of the Lotus Eaters. For a lot of people, it seemed to be a validation of dissipation and the idea of non-participation in society, the idea that you can withdraw and relax, that this is a very alluring thing. And I think that's absolutely true, but I also think that it's necessary to acknowledge the apprehension the poem has about that possibility. Not just in terms of the direct context of opium addiction in 19th century England, but in a more general sense, the idea that people would withdraw from society is one that Tennyson does a lot to validate the allure of that, I think, while also acknowledging the damage that that might do, or hinting at the possible damage of it. And I think it's interesting that in both poems, both in Ulysses and in the Lotus Eaters, it's very difficult actually to make simple declarative statements about what they mean. Tennyson in Ulysses is acknowledging, I think, the frailty of an older Odysseus, but also acknowledging the ongoing attraction of being a heroic figure. At the same time, I think he's also questioning heroism and questioning the value of that type of heroism in a modern age, because this vision of Odysseus is an older guy who maybe is reflecting on the ultimate futility of what he has dedicated his life to and how he has defined himself. And the notion of that kind of heroic voyage seems a little bit, silly almost, looking back, and he's unable to find any new way of defining himself, and so has to push outward and just do the same thing again to try and reclaim that flame. That's a kind of negative reading you could have of Ulysses. But in that, there's still a very sympathetic character. Odysseus remains a sort of pathetic figure, one that we have a sort of sense of feeling for in the poem. And I think he also there is something authentic in his commitment to always striving to do more as well. So there's a kind of ambiguity in that poem, and I think the same thing is true with the Lotus Eaters. It neither validates what they do, nor does it condemn them. Just as Ulysses is a kind of sympathetic figure, I think the Lotus Eaters themselves, Tennyson is trying to give us a sense of understanding of why people might feel the need to withdraw from a society. And so he's using the original text as a way to come to terms with a lot of the sort of challenges we face as humans, as members of societies, and trying to find a way to work through that that's both understanding while also cognizant of the need to be sort of socially engaged. When people were discussing the Keats poem, I think there was really, really interesting discussion in answer to the question about what lies behind this comparison between Cortez looking out on the Pacific Ocean and Keats, or Keats' speaker, reading Chapman's Homer. I think that what was most interesting about this discussion was the idea that Cortez is looking out on a whole new universe of possibilities, a whole new world, that anything is possible within, something with which he is completely unfamiliar. And obviously this is what the speaker of the poem experiences in opening a book like the Odyssey, that translation of this type, or adaptation, allows us to look into a world from which we are otherwise cut off. It allows us to have that sense of belonging. And that's the positive side of it. But I think as modern readers, we can also read Keats's poem across time and recognize that in the actions of people like Cortez, they weren't just encountering a blank space that they could interpret any way they saw fit. They were encountering people and societies that they had no particular understanding of. And they saw themselves as conquerors arriving in those places. So that the act of exploring South America was not necessarily a sort of utopian positive experience for everybody. And in some ways, the parallel with Cortez in reading the Odyssey may also be one where we see ourselves sort of conquering or adapting or remaking something like the Odyssey in our own image and attempting to bring the text to heel. There's a sense in which we are sometimes tempted to impose a moral framework of our own on the text that we read. And so reading the Keats poem might also remind us why that's problematic. The best discussions by far, I think, were around Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, and I can understand why that is. I think Atwood, obviously she's very famous now because of the Hulu the TV show based on The Handmaid's Tale, but she's also, she speaks very closely to issues of gender in our society, and obviously these things resonate with readers very strongly. She is always concerned with how women's voices are silenced, how female experience is overlooked or delegitimized in our society, and she seeks to find ways to amplify female voices and reassert female experience as being central to understanding the world. And in that context, we can definitely see what she's doing in a text like the Penelopiad. She is not so much, and this is one of the things that people sometimes were saying in their reading backwards and forwards essays, that she was in some sense correcting the original text, or clarifying something, that what really happened was that these maidservants were part of Penelope's plan. But obviously that's not there in the original text, so we can't say that that's what really happened. Rather, Atwood is changing the original text. She's making it so that the maidservants are now Penelope's, they're doing Penelope's will in fraternizing with the suitors. But I think the reason for doing this is to render the maidservants as more sympathetic characters. It's not so important that they're really in on Penelope's scheme. It's more that this perspective, like looking at them in that way, forces us to recognize that they are bound by certain power relationships. As maidservants, they have no power. They don't have any power, certainly within the house, and they don't have any decisions. They're not allowed to make decisions for themselves about how their own bodies are going to be used. And we find that in the Odyssey, women are frequently not in much control over their relationships with men. They are sort of subject anyway. The maidservants are doubly subject because they're also in a position, a social position, that is much weaker than people like Penelope. So the Penelopiad maybe forces us to recognize those power relationships, and then forces us to question what the original text is trying to do. Because if you look at the end of the Odyssey, it's all built on the idea of catharsis. And catharsis is about the idea that a text can build up a sense of frustration and angst. And you watch this in any movie where a main character, everything is going wrong for them, and you're hoping everything comes right. And when it does come right, that's the moment of catharsis. And in revenge movies like Kill Bill and things like that, the catharsis comes in the moment where the hero kills the people who did her wrong. And that's exactly what the Odyssey is. It's a cathartic text. It's all building up to Odysseus coming back and killing the suitors. And part of that catharsis is his brutal murder of these maidservants who fraternized with these men. Much more brutal than the murders that are committed of the suitors themselves. Suitors get warriors' deaths. These women are, first of all, forced to clean up and all of that sort of stuff, and then given a very lowly death, a hanging, in which their body is sort of presented as humiliated, and their body becomes a site of punishment and retribution. And that's part of the sort of satisfaction of the end of the text. And for Atwood, that's what's the problem. And she is sort of forcing us to recognize that our sense of catharsis as readers should be tempered here, that it should be cognizant of the fact that Odysseus is very much a representative of male power as well as aristocratic power, and that his actions are those of the powerful, and we're taking some sort of, or we're being asked at least to take some sort of satisfaction in his exertion of that power. It's also an interesting example of reading across time because, as modern readers, we're so shocked by his treatment of the maidservants. It's so excessive and so cruel and so violent that it reminds us that maybe as readers we are sort of imposing a moral framework on an ancient text that is maybe not appropriate for it. I bring this up because when we're reading across time, we are sort of tempted to impose those sort of moral values of our own on an ancient text, and it can be a very positive and empowering thing to do so, as we see in the case of Atwood. It can become more problematic and more dangerous when we start doing that while reading across cultures, which is what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks. I haven't seen too much of the discussion around Sophocles just yet, because you guys are still formulating those posts. But looking forward to Soyinka, it's going to be interesting to see, well, how do we respond to a text in which the moral values that inform the behavior of the main African characters, the Yoruba characters, which are often interpreted by students in the West as being sort of morally wrong or morally incomprehensible even, what it means to read a text like that, and how do we go about reading such a text without imposing a set of moral values of our own, without being cognizant of or responsive to the moral values of the culture we're reading into. And what's interesting about the Soyinka text is that the playwright himself has built that problem into the text, because the district officer, the colonial officer Pilkings, and his wife are themselves sort of responsible for exactly that same kind of reading across cultures, where in encountering the rituals and beliefs and actions of another culture, there is no effort really being made to come to an understanding of what that is. So looking forward to that play, I'm interested in how you respond not just to the themes of the play, not just to the action of it, although that's really important, but also to questions of form, because this is a play that's concerned with Western dramatic forms and styles, as well as Western values and actions. And it's also concerned with African styles of communication, African styles of drama, and also Yoruba moral values and rituals. And it's interested in the tension between those two. So as readers, for most of us, as readers from another culture, how do we respond to that very different cultural context? And that's ultimately what we're concerned about. Is it's similar in some ways to what we've been doing in terms of reading across time, but in some ways there's more at stake, and that's what will be interesting to see as we progress. I hope you're enjoying reading Sophocles and all of that, and I really hope you enjoy comparing and contrasting Sophocles with Soyinka and thinking about the ways that Soyinka incorporates elements of Greek tragedy, but also with how he departs from that and how he incorporates other cultural practices and beliefs, and thinking about what that does to tragedy and how is this a different type of tragedy than the one that we've been reading this week with Oedipus. Okay, so we'll leave it at that, and I hope you're enjoying everything. If you have any questions, the usual thing applies. Get in touch as quickly as possible. I'll get back to you as quickly as possible. I did overlook 1 or 2 emails last week. I'm really sorry for doing that. If I don't get back to you, do bug me about it. I'm happy to respond. I'm normally good about it. I'll try and stay good about it. Thank you very much. Bye now.